Mike McDermott, and I'm an American soldier, although I find myself standing in an ever-diminishing group of former soldiers. Time marches on, and one of those lessons is that the size of my organization seems to be getting smaller. At any rate, my purpose in this video is to introduce you to this book, which I recently completed. The Campaign Streamers of the United States Army, A Battle History of Sacrifice and Courage. This is where I describe each of the 192 campaigns that the American Army has fought since 1775. The very first action, of course, being on the Lexington Green. And those campaigns continued over the years until today. There's still an ongoing campaign where the Army is pursuing and dealing with international terrorism, threats to our security. Today, I want to take a look at this book and see how it's organized, and how it's contained, and how I put it together. But first, I must tell you how honored I am that a distinguished soldier, a man who holds a PhD in history and who has written several highly acclaimed books, General H.R. McMaster, has agreed to write the foreword to this book. What I'd like to do today is start this video by reading the dedication to the book. And the dedication says, "The book is dedicated to my brothers and sisters in arms who, over the centuries, have served and continue to serve our nation by accomplishing the United States Army's mission. The true faith and allegiance of America's soldiers is at the very heart of our national story. Our loyalty to a cause greater than self describes who we are. May God remember and bless us, each and every one." Turning the page, we find the table of contents. And this is the first opportunity that we have to take a look at the variety of colors associated with the campaign streamers. As an example, all of the campaigns of the Revolutionary War are embroidered on a campaign streamer in those specific colors. The Civil War, which starts the description of the various campaigns, starts on page 76. Each campaign is embroidered on the streamers colored blue and gray, reflecting the uniforms of North and South. The streamers of the Korean War, as an example, are all depicted in United Nations blue. And as we saw in the first video, the Vietnam War campaigns are superimposed on campaign streamers that reflect the flag of South Vietnam. Next comes the introduction. Now, I realize that it's going to be a little bit dry as I go through the organization of the book, but it's important because there's content here which is unique to this particular book. The introduction starts the story of how the Army records its campaign history. Initially, during the very first year of the Civil War, at a battle in Springfield, Missouri, the commander requested that all of the regiments involved in that battle embroider the word Springfield on their national colors. It was the very first time that the Army began to publicly display its combat history. It was a good idea, and in fact, the Congress blessed it at Christmas time, 1861. And from that time on, regiments embroidered the battles that they'd been involved in on their regimental flag. But it took some time and some developments until the Army standardized the process. Some of those regimental flags were overburdened with embroidery. And what the Army did was shift from individual battles to establishing a history of campaigns. And it's those campaigns that are now standardized. But the very first campaign, Lexington 1775, is the first one that I described. Now it's done in about 1,100 words on 2 facing pages. And there's a legitimate critique of my approach to telling these stories. And that is that it's not possible to do justice to some of these campaigns, and particularly some of the big ones. Say Bull Run, Appomattox, the air war over Europe in World War II, or the breakout from Normandy, as an example. And it's a legitimate criticism. But the fact is, my purpose here is to simply give a condensed history lesson on 2 facing pages so that when the page is turned, the next campaign in the sequence appears. And they are done in chronological order from beginning to end of various wars. Once the Revolutionary War concluded, the United States conducted a second war with England, the War of 1812. And the purpose and the outcome was to clearly identify our national sovereignty. The War of 1812 started as a catastrophe. The United States attempted to invade Canada, and it turned out bad. The British actually occupied Washington, D.C., and burned much of it. And the war didn't end until a hopeful note was struck by Jackson down in New Orleans when he defeated a British expeditionary force. And it was a fight that actually ended several weeks after the war had ended, but because of bad communications, those involved and New Orleans didn't really know that the war was over. At any rate, many of the campaigns that the American Army has fought have been largely forgotten. They were certainly important for the soldiers who participated, but what I'm able to do here is resurrect some of those battles and some of those campaigns. Palo Alto, the first battle during the American War with Mexico in 1846, as an example. Little known today, but certainly important at the time. And it's followed, of course, by other Mexican War battles. And then we come to the American Civil War. The first campaign at Fort Sumter, and the whole list of campaigns during the Civil War continue until the final campaign streamer identified as Appomattox. A series of wars conducted against American Indian tribes started 1 year after the current Constitution was ratified, 1789. The following year, 1790, the American Army conducted a campaign against the Miami tribe in the Old Northwest, states now of Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana. And a series of battles and campaigns were conducted against various Indian tribes for 100 years, until the last campaign, which was 1890, a battle at Wounded Knee up in South Dakota. One of the more interesting campaigns of the modern era occurred in 1941 to 45, called the Anti-Submarine Campaign. It was conducted by the U.S. Army's Air Force against German submarines along the eastern seaboard of the United States, down in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Caribbean, and as far south as Venezuela. The Army handed that mission off to the Navy in mid-1943. But what's interesting is if this campaign is charted from beginning to end, it was a multi-service, multinational battle, and it was the longest campaign of the Second World War. Eventually, we finish up all of the campaigns with the close of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then turn to the appendix. The appendix is the first time that we have an opportunity to take a look at the specific campaigns of each war. Revolutionary War, as an example, began at Lexington, and a series of campaigns were conducted until Yorktown, when the French and the Americans, commanded by George Washington, accepted a British surrender. Each of the wars is listed, and all of the campaigns conducted during these wars gives you an idea of the extent of the combat history of the Army. Civil War is an example, starting at Sumter, finally ended up at Appomattox. But all of these campaigns are listed in embroidery on a streamer attached to the Army flag. And they continue, war by war, campaign by campaign, until we get to a recommended reading list. Now, recognizing that the full story cannot be told in 1,100 words, I have put together a recommended reading list for each war. As an example, for the person who wants to dig deeper into the stories of the Revolutionary War, I have a list of authors and their books to pursue. So too, War of 1812, Mexican War, Civil War, and on until the current day. And lastly, endnotes. The endnotes do two things. Not only do they identify the source of quotations and specifics in each of those stories, but I also expand in some cases on portions of each of the campaign stories, which allows the reader to learn a little bit more about what occurred in that specific campaign. And that comprises the contents of the book. In my next video, I intend to provide an account of my own 32 years of active federal service, both enlisted and commissioned in the United States Army. And that's going to be my way of establishing my credentials, my qualifications for telling these stories. The stories of the Army's campaigns, which in fact reflect the larger story of our national development. As we go through that history, I want you to consider how the purpose of America's wars have changed over time. Initially, and for almost 200 years, American soldiers fought wars that were critical to our development and to our national security. The Revolution and the Second War of Independence established our national sovereignty. The Mexican War and the Indian Wars secured our territorial boundaries and ensured the security of Americans within those boundaries. Now, whether one agrees with the whys and the wherefores of those particular wars, the outcome was integral to how our modern state has been established. The Civil War was required to ensure the integrity of the United States as one nation, while also bringing an end to slavery in this country. The World Wars required us to become involved because of the threats to our national security. And with the end of the Cold War, thankfully fought without a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union, the United States found itself dominant on the world stage. And then it seems to me that the United States embarked on a series of wars that were expensive in treasure spent and soldiers killed or wounded. These are wars that tested American resolve and that resulted in massive dissension and protests here in the United States. They've also been wars where the results began to chip away at America's international reputation, at how our friends and allies began to question our reliability, and how our own sense of national purpose began to shift. The United States has been accused of abusing our superpower status by pursuing ill-considered short-term goals that took on a life of their own and eventually became expensive and embarrassing. So again, as I tell the developing story of America's growth and of the Army's campaigns, which were integral to that development, I want you to consider a larger lesson, one that goes beyond military strategy and tactical maneuver. And I'll begin to relate those stories with my next presentation, the third video in this series. Now don't hesitate to comment on this video and on my comments. I look forward to our conversation, which will be the result of your comments. And until then, I look forward to you joining me. The best to you and yours, and may God bless America.